The canyon kept its light until the last moment. The canyon kept its light until the last moment, then gave it back in knives. Small, patient knives, circles of burnished glass wedged in crevices where goats slept by day. When dusk came on, those circles found the torches below and returned them tenfold, glare blooming off red rock and setting horse eyes to white. Clay jars hung on pegs above the track. A boot or a spear butt would knock one loose. The jar would tumble. The viper inside would not like the fall. Gerold Dayne stood above the line of travel with a fig in his palm. The boy he had hired for breath and horn sat cross-legged in the shadow of a thorn, bare feet dusty, eyes large. Gerold tossed him the fig. The boy did not smile. "Once," Gerold said. The boy nodded and put the fig in his pocket. Far down the wash, a horn answered moonrise with a thin, angry note, and the canyon made a second horn out of it. The mirrors flared as the first outrider lifted his brand. A horse went sideways. A rider swore. A clay jar broke like a plate, and something hissed. Men drew steel. Men always drew steel when they could not see. Gerold did not wait to watch the rest of it. He had set the little theatre. He left it to play. The Torrentine at the ford was a black belt with a white buckle. He went through it sideways, not fighting, feeling the stones count to him underfoot. The water bit his hips and let him go. He dragged the horse after by the rein. The far bank gave him reeds whispering and the smell of old salt. West, the pale stone of Starfall showed its first few lights in the high windows, and the sea spoke in the voice it used for cliffs. At the thorn copse he cinched the girth, ran a hand along the horse's neck, and mounted. He rode without speaking. The river spoke enough. Starfall sat its headland like a white blade in a dark scabbard. The pale stone sword tower took moonlight and made a cold thing out of it. Down under the roots of the rock, tide-made and unmade caves with each pull of the sea. One of those caves had a tarred rope inside it, tied high in shadow beyond the reach of spray. He had tied it himself a fortnight ago and measured the knots with his fingers, counting, remembering. He left the horse and went up hand over hand. Pale stone sweated under his fingers. He paused once for a wave to spend itself, and then climbed into the seam where cellars bled into underways. Salt, oil, wool. The keep breathed those old smells in its sleep. He moved with them. The first guard he found had a lantern and a careful cough. Gerold put a hand to the man's throat and the point of a knife to his cheek. "Quiet," he said. The man was. The knife took a tear of blood and no more. "Now you can say you fought," Gerold said, knocking the man unconscious with the butt of his sword, and went on. The locks at Starfall had been bought good and kept long. 4 pins, stiff spring. The rake in his sleeve had eaten worse. He listened with his thumb. The door decided to be a door. Inside, someone had made a chapel of a vault. Racks for spears, blue velvet, a stand shaped like an upturned palm. On the wall above the stand, cut deep and painted dark, the family words. The morning never lies. The sword lay on the stand, and the gauze that covered it had been arranged by a careful hand. The blade beneath was pale as milk, with a sober edge that promised nothing, and therefore everything. The scabbard stood in its own place, empty and ready. He did not touch the gauze at once. He went to the far wall instead, and looked upon the plaques hung there. Gerold Dayne, Sword of the Morning. The letters were beaten old, a drawn sun behind a white blade. Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning. Newer, Cleaner letters, pride and grief inside their neatness. Below those, smaller names. Corwin Dayne, the second son who had never been anyone's sword. His father's hand in a boy's script, long lines and too much pressure. Miles Dayne, not a sword, not a lord, just stone that said, served. Men had written truth in the White House in their own ways. He put his palm to the old stone once, for the tiredness in it. Then he went back to the stand. Dawn came up in both hands, like a weight he had guessed true before he felt it. Cold went into his palms and stayed there. He held the length of the blade and watched it catch lantern light and give it back as a wrong color, not white and not anything else. He waited for some story to wake and tell him it was his. No story did. This pleased him. The door behind him opened in a way that said, keys and care. Gerold set the sword across the stand again and turned to look. "Gerold," said the man in the door. He wore a mail shirt under a half-robe dyed a sober lavender, with the falling star sewn on the breast. His hair was iron at the temple, and his eyes were stone that had not yet decided on a crack. The sword in his hand was sharp enough, but made for work, not fame. "Miles," Gerold said. The castellan stepped within and shut the door behind him without looking away. "What will you do?" "3 moves," Gerold said. "Then you tell the house you did your duty, and I tell it you live." Miles Dayne raised his sword. The first move was a lie of distance. Gerold gave ground a half-step, just enough to invite the thrust, then turned his wrist as if he were turning a key. Steel kissed stone instead of flesh. Sparks jumped. The castellan's knuckles rapped the wall hard enough to numb his fingers, and the sword point wavered. The second move was the taking. Gerold slid inside the castellan's guard, while the older man was still feeling for his grip. He struck the sword arm at the wrist, bone on bone, quick and ugly, then hooked the blade with his own and wrenched. Miles tried to hold on. Pride held longer than muscle. The steel went clattering across the flagstones all the same. The third move was the payment. Gerold's knife appeared low, under mail and courtesy both. He did not slash for the throat, too clean, too kind. He drove the point into the soft place beneath the ribs and twisted just enough to make breath expensive. Not killing, never that. A lesson needed a witness. Miles folded a fraction, one hand braced on his knee, the other pressed to his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and steady. His eyes stayed hard. "You think yourself hard," he rasped. Gerold stepped past him as if the man were furniture. He lifted the pale blade from its upturned palm, and for a heartbeat, the vault seemed colder for it. He wrapped Dawn in an ash cloak with no color to claim it, and slung it across his back. "I think your words are soft," he said. His gaze went to the lintel, to the house comfort cut in stone. The morning never lies. "Do they comfort you, uncle?" "Do they comfort you?" Miles said, voice tight with pain. "To do this to your own?" "Comfort?" Gerold glanced at the plaques on the far wall, names hammered into reverence. "That is the word that put boys up there." He took the scabbard shape and set its edge to the stone above the door. He carved slowly, so the sound of it filled the room like prayer turned wrong. Dust rose in the lantern light. He blew once to clear the grooves. "Morning is a lie." Miles looked from the cut letters to the wrapped sword on Gerold's back. Something in his face went old, but it did not break. "You have the blade," Miles said, breath tight, "but you do not have the name." Gerold did not look back at the plaques. "Names," he said, "are for walls." He left the vault with the white sword riding his back like a cold promise. On the landing, he stopped long enough to tuck a folded scrap of paper beneath a stone weight, plain, deliberate, written in a hand that wanted to be neat even when it did not feel neat. Ser Balon Swann, I fight the man, not the house. Come find the night. A boy waited in the stairwell shadows, thin as a whisper. Gerold held the paper out. The boy took it with both hands, as if it might bite. "To the rookery," Gerold said. The boy ran like a thing chased by tide. In the underways, 2 guards found him in a passage made narrow on purpose, as if the castle liked ambushes when it was frightened. One reached too wide. Gerold took his fingers for the mistake, quick, precise. The other came in lower, braver. Gerold gave him his knee back wrong and let him keep the rest of himself. Both would live. Gerold told them so. Sometimes a man believed what he was told, when he was still busy deciding where the pain ended. At the sea gate, the rope hung where he had left it, tarred and rough against pale stone. He went down hand over hand with the wrapped blade balanced against his shoulder. Below, the skiff nudged the cave wall like a hound that knew the scent of home. He slipped into it and set the single oar to its notch, pulling once, then again, to keep himself in the black seam the tide had cut. Above, Starfall woke. Its alarms were a different music than the canyons had been, older, prouder. Horns for weather, horns for fire, horns for blood. Tonight, the keep played them all. In that sound was a word the house would not say aloud, a word that stood before the vault and watched dust settle into fresh-cut stone. Morning is a lie. Gerold kept to the dark line under the cliff and let rock pass over him like a closing hand. When the cave widened, the air thinned, saltier, sharper. Out beyond, the sea waited, patient, without mercy, as if it had been waiting all along. He rowed, one-armed, letting the current touch the hull and deny it a moment later. He did not look back. Men had carved words on stone for that. 2 days later, riders crossed the river at the ford and made for the goat path up High Hermitage. They found rooms that smelled of dry stone, a hearth laid with cold ash, and a ribbon of purple twisted once and left in a dish of oil. They found viper jars that had been set and not sprung. They found a horn in a thorn bush with fig skins under it. Obara Sand threw the horn down and broke it with a heel. Areo Hotah watched dust hang in a beam and then go wherever things go when they are finished being dust. Swann asked for a ladder and climbed to the roof to watch wind comb the hills. He had a letter now, in a neat hand that had wanted to be neater. He read it again, and folded it again, and put it under the white cloak he wore with steadiness. Gerold was not there to see these things. He heard of them in a courtyard on the road to Skyreach, where a water seller repeated them as if he had been born in that canyon and was proud of it. The man had a gold tooth and a voice that did not belong to any single village. He sold news as he sold water, honest, then not, sweet, then not. There were a dozen men in the shade listening. Gerold listened too. The water seller made a small star with his fingers when he said Dorne. Men always made shapes with their hands when they spoke the name of a blade. Hard to believe, a goatherd said. True enough to drink, the seller replied, and smiled with his gold. Gerold put a copper on the board and did not drink. He watched the water tremble to a breeze and stop again. The sword on his back had a different weight than other swords. Men's eyes learned it if they were the sort to notice. No eyes in this yard were that sort today. He rode out at noon, and the hills took him like a pocket takes a coin.